Okay, so in this video, again, I'm going to talk about Christianity and some of the psychological consequences of Christianity in Western thought and ideation. And what I want to talk about in this video is the relationship between Christianity and nihilism, and why it is the case that from a Christian psychogenealogical standpoint, that nihilism becomes a philosophical I will say at this point in time, worldview, because there are certainly not people who would actively identify as nihilists in the world. Though I would say at this point in time, nihilism, in terms of its um, analytical interpretation, is further removed from its psychogenealogical origins. But I would like to flesh them out just because I think it's interesting. And you can let me know what you think. But suffice to say that there is something that has to be understood about the Christian story that is necessary in understanding the function of um, psychology that gives nihilism the intuitive betting that it needs to be a functional idea. And so what I mean by that is that I think that human beings, I'm a phenomenologist, and so I think more so in the sense that we come to understand the world and ourselves and what things are in the world from being in the world and interacting with them. And it's through this interaction or this experience of phenomena in the world that you develop mental representations that you use to um, make sense of the rest of the world around you in sort of a comparative and shorthand way. It's these things that we can understand, know, and interact with in the world that we gain our intuitions for making sense of the broader or larger uh, world that's further and further away from our characterological or um, immediate psychological experiences. And so, because I think that this has a certain consequence in terms of what makes up philosophical ideas or where philosophical ideas come from, because I definitely agree with Nietzsche to a certain extent that whenever you're reading a certain philosopher, you're reading something that tells you more about the philosopher than it necessarily does the subject matter it might entail, or the ideas that are necessarily a part of its discussion. Because why there are so many different takes on what truth is, or there are so many different vantage points and perspectives on any one philosophical concept, is because there are differences in people's personalities and cultures across philosophical history in terms of those individuals who have contributed to what we, or I would call, Western philosophy, which does not necessarily have to be a Western thinking person. And yeah, anyways. So, and I guess I would say that this is what I mean by, or at least I'm trying to lead to what I mean by um, genealogical. Um, so I guess I would say that because you can understand that this influences the way that the philosopher sees or understands the world, you have to know that this is also a part of what makes up their argument, or the way that they represent their ideas, or what intuitions that they use to develop their ideas, and like what would necessarily make sense to them. Because if you're talking about a philosophical concept, it's something of a pattern of a relationship in the world that you think that you're experiencing or that you've reasoned out. And so, to be frank, even though philosophy is is of a certain form that's, let's say, analytical or technical, its technicality or appearance is still a matter of style or take, because there are ideas that are germane to philosophy or that have been derived in philosophy that are also a part of, say, theoretical physics or mathematics or biology. Perhaps their articulation in modern times is very different from their initial philosophical um, progenitors, but the ideas are characterologically related, nonetheless. So even if it's not the case that when um, even though we think of something different than Plato did about truth, we still have ideas about the nature of truth, and we still think about the nature of truth relatively from like a cultural standpoint. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. I have different ideas on like the status of philosophy versus like historically what's true about philosophy. And so I would say that there are definitely philosophers that still care about truth, but they're not going to think of it in the same way that Plato thinks about it, because Hegel is more right in the sense that philosophy is something of an evolving dynamic process, and it's better thought of as a culture, a culture across like history. And that's what philosophy is, an ever evolving like transcultural history. Even though you can say that there's Western philosophy or Eastern philosophy, there's a lot of overlap, and especially within like more recent points in human history, a lot of intermingling. And I mean, I have like the idea of pollination, I would say, because that's the way that I would analogize this. Because part of the reason why I think people miss things is because we, um, I don't know, there's just a certain perspective I have. And because I have a certain perspective, these are the ways that I see these patterns. And so that's what I think is that's what I would say is going on between the East and the West that makes philosophy, though it's like two streams or something like that, they keep turning back in on themselves. Like, I don't know, like, um, even though you could say Western and Eastern philosophy are different things, there's something that's like the same about both, because philosophy, as in terms of why people do it, is because of something that's true about human beings, like something that's true within the character and capacities of the human animal. And so that's why you're going to see something that's very similar to whatever different people and cultures have thought of as philosophy over time. And maybe what we do as philosophers in the modern sphere is just give different appearances or add to the varying layers of something that we're working out and have been trying to understand for a very long time. And because philosophy has this characteristic, when you look at an idea, for instance, like say Christianity, sorry, Christianity is not like purely a philosophy or something like that. But if you're going to think of philosophy here now, because we're talking about nihilism, as something that has this more etymological and genealogical way about it, then why would it be the case that nihilism would be a type of philosophical idea that would emerge in the first place? That's the question I want to like answer. And so I think because Christianity, with respects to its narrative, has a particular way of seeing the world or seeing like the human condition or the creation. And it's because Christianity has a certain like take on the creation and human existence that a certain set of ideas like come to bear in the mind of Western individuals because of the way the world is in like a very real in a very real way. And because of the curse in Genesis, you have that the true nature of the world is terrible or tragic or demonic or sinful or evil. The general term that you will hear Christians use is fallen. And fallen is not exactly saying that something is completely devoid of good. It's just to say that there's a certain belief at one point in time that everything was good and that the status of things that are now are some marred version or picture of that once like absolute or supreme good. But because you know you once had like absolute or supreme good, this stuff we're seeing now has to be pretty bad. Like has to be pretty terrible. And that's what fallen, like that's what the state of fallen is. And so because that's how we see, or at least that's a narrative that Christianity promotes, like in terms of a vision of the world, um, because there is actual pain and suffering in the world, and there are tragic things that happen to human beings in our existence, it's a believable reality. Because whether or not people think like um, multiple like universes exist or whatever, everyone knows that suffering exists. Well, I don't know if I would say yeah, I mean, I would say everybody knows suffering exists. That you don't have to convince people across the span of human existence, like from the very beginning of our emergence, excuse me, to now. It seems that people have needed a reason to explain suffering, but that you do not have to convince people that suffering is real. And because this is a like an existential property or like character of human existence, suffering became associated with the fact that the world was cursed or fallen or terrible or evil. There's something fundamentally wrong with it. Um, Same with human nature. Why do people do bad things? It's not because there are psychological, maybe genetic and historical cultural differences amongst people. Material questions of like resource distribution and nutrition or whatever. But that's very different than believing that people do things because people are evil. And that's what Christians believe or believed. And so, because I think Nietzsche is more right in the sense that when you're thinking about human beings from maybe a broader cultural, like historical perspective, which he gets from Hegel, which I definitely like to read Hegel. I think that when you think about the evolution of intellectual history, I guess, where this is probably where um, I just think it makes sense, like from a certain narrativistic standpoint. So that's why I'm going to present it this way. So if you think about the evolution of philosophical ideas in Western history, there's going to have to be a point or a place where philosophers start to try and make sense of why there is suffering in the world. No, I don't think I like that. So, I guess I'd put it like this. Because there's a narrativistic sense or grammar to our mind, the Western mind, when we first start thinking about like what the existential characteristic of the world is going to be, or like what metaphysical realities are, we're going to make sense of that from the grammatical historical like reality of our minds, like how we see the world because we are certain cultural historical things. And because like this is to me the way our like broader or like larger evolution of ideas happens like on a cultural level. um I mean, just to be clear, what I think is that ideas evolve and emerge from other ones. And so I don't think that you can have it the case that you have nihilism, like as we understand it, without the Christian narrative, because there has to be some kind of, to me, because human beings are not rational, there has to be some kind of intuitive, like emotional drive underneath the relevancy of the idea, or like why people care to pay attention to it, or why do people have to talk about it. Because whenever people want to disclose information, like amongst each other, it's because there's some kind of shared experience or activity that we're trying to event, state of affairs, something that we're trying to make sense of. And that's why, like, culture or devices or books or whatever emerge, because there's this shared state of affairs that human beings care about, either like uniquely within a culture or across cultures. And philosophy is like such a thing like this. And maybe that's why I'm thinking about it like this. And so, because I think that this is how it works from a metaphysical standpoint, because like this is a certain like metaphysical perspective, not like, yeah, it's definitely phenomenological. So I'm having a hard time putting like the boundaries on these things, but man, okay, let me think. Well, because I just want to come to the end, I guess. Here's what I'll say. Here's what I'll say. Because the world is understood as a cursed or evil thing, when God leaves the world, that doesn't mean that the world loses the characteristics of the things that convinced you that it was cursed. So there's something that's true about the nature of existence or the world that makes people see the world like this from a phenomenological standpoint. Like, why does this idea make sense to us? But when God disappears, like, maybe the rationale for those things in the world that once seemed to speak or convince us of the existence of God no longer made sense. And so, because those things that we once, as Jung would put it, populated with meaning, changed in their meaning, like, we can't project or like populate the world sensically with this archetype or imbue it with this, because it just comes from our mind. Like, it does, but it's not because it doesn't make sense. It's because our mind is trying to make sense of the world. It's just there are many ways to make sense of the world. And whatever, man, like, there, I guess, like this, like, the part of our minds that makes sense of the world like this is not necessarily verbal. So it's not as yeah, see, this is problem of tangents. Yeah, so because I haven't thought of this one yet. Um, I'm just kind of following the roller coaster or the train cars of ideas and stringing it along as I go. But there seems to be something here that I need to consider more. But I really want to finish saying this thing about nihilism because I always want to give a rationale for why I say whatever it is I say. But I think this, so let's just say, whenever I read nihilism, I think like what nihilism is like motivationally about is trying to understand what the like sum total value of existence is, because existence is bereft with suffering. And because like nihilism is like this, like there's an objectivity to nihilism from like a certain vantage point, but it's like you can't like I feel like this, all philosophies are perspectives. They're just vantage points, ways of looking at the world and seeing it. And once you put that vantage point or take that perspective on, it will make sense. But when you realize that is due to a certain taken perspective, you won't necessarily consider it true. And so that's how I see it. And whenever I look at the kind of frame of perspective as nihilism, it's very similar to the frame and perspective of the world as something cursed, because there has to be a reason or a justification for this cursed nature of the world. Like Nietzsche said it, man does not need a reason for the fact that there are good things in the world. Man needs a reason for the fact that he suffers, or that suffering is a part of the world. Purpose is most instrumental for facing suffering in the world, and we can face any kind of suffering with sufficient purpose or meaning or why. Some kind of like belief, drive, or like ideal, which um when you believe the world is cursed and you also believe that there are no things like beliefs, rationale, and ideals, the only thing you're left with is a cursed world that's meaningless. And so the only logical conclusion is death. And so in that way, there's like a final judgment, or like apocalypse or Armageddon, and that's possibly why those very apocalyptic and Armageddon like movies were popular in the 90s. But yeah, so that's ultimately what I think about nihilism. Um, at this point in my thinking. So, um, I think it's, I guess, like in conclusion, I think it's very Christian to be nihilistic from a certain vantage point. And so, yeah, that's my video, and thank you for watching. Hopefully, it made sense.